Hello. Hey, everybody. Sorry, I have little tiny ears and this thing doesn't fit on very well. All right, thanks so much for coming. I really don't have a good idea of who's attending, so can I get a show of hands? Who here's a game developer? A couple, oh, well, almost everybody. All right, any students? A couple of students? Animators. So, all right, awesome. Okay, so I am just going to do a quick intro of myself. My name is Simon. I am an animator. I've been an animator since about 2000. That makes me very old. I started going to school at a school called Vancouver Film School in Vancouver, BC. My first job was in TV. I worked at a studio called Mainframe Entertainment. You probably haven't heard of it, but you might have heard of some shows they did, like Reboot. Back then, getting a job was all you needed to know was how to turn the computer on, so that was good for me. After that, I worked on a bunch of kids shows there. I moved on to electronic arts. I was there for about 9 years. I ended up becoming the lead cinematic animator there. And then I moved on to Square Enix, IO Interactive in Copenhagen. I was there for 3 years. I was the animation director on Hitman Absolution. After that, I took a leave. I went back to Vancouver, and I worked some freelance and a little bit of indie development. I was at a place called V7, and nobody's heard of it because it never actually shipped a game, but I was the art director there and the cinematic director. I went down to LA after that. I was the lead animator and art director at a company called Robotoki. We also didn't ship a game there. After that, I took another little break. I worked freelance for some places like PsyOp, which does music videos, TV shows, advertisements. Other companies like Zynga and Phosphor and a bunch of places. Did freelance for quite some time. And now I'm at Phoenix Labs, where I'm an animator there. I also teach. I teach at Vancouver Film School, which is where it all started. I've also taught at schools like Gnomon and iAnimate and some other lectures here and there. So just a quick bit about Phoenix Labs as well. So we're a new company, independent. There's about 40 of us there. We're working on our first game together. It's a very experienced group of people. We've come from a bunch of different larger companies. This is kind of an example of some of the places we've worked. So you can see we're kind of not really strangers to big teams, big projects, large scopes. But we wanted to keep it small. We're about 40 people. And that's because we wanted to maintain sort of empowerment on the team, avoid a lot of the pitfalls that commonly happen on larger teams where it tends to plague productivity or being able to make decisions quickly, pivot fast, things like that. And ultimately what we really wanted was to have an environment where we worked with people we really, really loved and ultimately spend the rest of our careers making games that we were passionate about and things that we really enjoyed doing and try to minimize the time spent doing things we don't. So our first game that we're working on right now is called Dauntless. Sorry, I'm just going to take a sip here. And it is a multiplayer action RPG. Basically, you get together with 3 of your friends, go and hunt these giant behemoths, and they are trying to destroy your shattered world. You can tell I've practiced that line a few times. So before I get into a little bit more detail, I'm going to just show you guys a little gameplay trailer we threw together a couple weeks ago, and then we'll get back to it. So, that's a filler slide. All right. So most of my career, I've been animating humans, realistic humans, sports, strangling people, shooting guns, all kinds of those things. So I was super excited to come to Phoenix and finally get to animate creatures, and stylized ones at that, stylized players, not have to worry too much about focusing on that uncanny valley and trying to cross it. So what I want to talk about today is some of the things we've learned along the way. This was new to me when I first started. It's been 2.5 years, 3 years of just focusing on this. And the learning curve was quite steep. When I started out, I've never really animated. Aside from a dog and maybe a horse, never really spent much time doing creatures. So we've just been learning through failure, learning through trial and error, and making our way here. So I want to talk about some of the stuff I picked up, how to create believable experiences with interactive creatures. And also, a lot of this is going to be told through the perspective of a small studio. Everything we do is to try to get the most mileage out of every asset we make. There's a lot of this stuff that can be done at scale for larger teams, but we don't really get the luxury of throwing people at problems. We need to throw solutions at them. So the tone of a lot of this is going to be, here's how I got the most bang for our buck when we were doing it. So a few things I'm going to talk about. We're going to start super high level on sort of theory on how we choose the behemoth, how we go about creating the game design and things around that, and also down to sort of engine side, how we orchestrate these things to create some sort of an immersive experience. And also just kind of end it with a little bit of what we're still working on, what we're struggling with. But before I do that, I'm just going to go on a little bit of a tangent, as I always do. And I just want to talk about some slightly confused topics when it comes to game development. And one thing I want to start with is believability versus realism. The title of it is Creating Believable Behemoths. And I find a lot of times on teams, we tend to use the term realistic to describe something that really what we mean is believable. When I say realism, what we really mean is basically it's a copy of something that exists or could possibly exist in the world that we know, obeying the rules of our universe. A great example of this would be the Indominus Rex from Jurassic World. The I-Rex, I'm going to call it I-Rex because that's easier. He never existed, he or she. But because this creature is based off of a lot of things that we commonly know about dinosaurs, you can also see a lot of real-world examples of creatures that we do know, like right here in these shots, very dog-like. It just becomes easier for us to place this creature in our world on top of these live-action plates, and the surfacing, all those things just kind of play into that. Some other examples would be Avatar. That might be slightly pushed a little bit more in that direction, like six-legged horse. But essentially, when we talk about realism, this is kind of where I want to reference. Believability, on the other hand, is something slightly different. There it is. So I'm just going to watch this scene. Hopefully everybody here has seen Toy Story 3, but I just want to show this, and then we'll talk about it. still gets me. So none of these toys are real. They're not real toys. The lighting, the surfacing, the environment, it's all very stylized, very sort of, I guess stylized is the best word. But most people, hopefully I'm not alone in this, teared up a little when you first saw that scene, right? There's a lot of history behind that shot. There's a lot of subtext in those characters and what's going on there. We're going to talk about subtext in a little bit. But if you've been watching that series, has anybody not seen Toy Story 3? Hands? Okay, good. I'd be worried if you didn't. So you could see how you believe in these characters' situation, the subtext of that scene, what's at stake for them in those moments, and that's believable. You believed in them. When we talk about creatures to be believable, same like this, they obey the rules of that universe. Anytime you kind of break that is when you break that believability, break that immersion. And it doesn't matter, as long as those rules and those things that live in that universe are consistent. So it could be magic, or there's no gravity, or there's an infinite set of variables that things can live in to become believable. They just have to be consistent within themselves. So when you combine that context and subtext, and you have that sort of connection to the laws of the universe, then you have all the things in place to create a believable performance. Now, our art style in Dauntless is definitely not realistic, and we have a lot of rules in our universe that don't exist in our current, our real universe. So our behemoths needed to fit within this stylized universe that we created. We can feel it, and you can think about this in any film you've seen where you were pulled out of the experience, pulled out of the immersion of the experience, is when some of those things were broken or disconnected. We know very fast in our game if we've broken those things, and we often do change them just because we are still in development, so we have the luxury of changing rules to fit our game that we're trying to do. But once the game is finished, once the game is live, we can't really do that anymore. So we're in a lucky spot right now where we can start bending our own rules a little bit, but soon that's not going to be the case. So that's believability versus realism. There's one more thing I want to talk quickly about, and that's the different challenges that games versus film face when we talk about making believable creatures and telling stories with these creatures. So for film is really a 2D experience. It's a linear experience. When you're animating, you're essentially animating a drawing. You're animating a still frame over time. Everything you're doing is to fit in that frame. You're animating to camera. Your story, your timing, your character exposition, your story exposition, all of that is controlled. There's no way to break a film. Your users can't be in the theater unless they're like throwing stuff at the screen. Maybe they can break your experience. But nobody can just do anything crazy to change the story. The outcome is pretty much the same for everybody. There's some subjectivity there, but for the most part, it's on rails. Whereas in a game, it's interactive. Surprise. So your creatures need to react to external input. So it could be the player, it could be the environment, and do so in a believable manner. So you can think back, if anybody here plays a lot of games, obviously a lot of game developers, you can think where you can start to see the AI working. Our job is to try to reduce that from happening as often as possible. Your end result always isn't the same. I mean, it depends what game you're playing. Uncharted typically will end in the same place, but open world games where emergent stories come out, that path can wander quite. And it's easy to break immersion. It's so easy. Whenever you see, especially there's so many game developers here, we know how the sausage is made. So it's easy to see where those breakpoints are. So our job is, again, to try to smooth that out as much as we can. So we want to make believable, interactive creatures. So I'm talking about our challenge right now. So we want to make believable, interactive creatures that both look and play well in an online multiplayer environment where players are constantly smacking them on the head with weapons. So no problem, right? So I'm going to start with pre-production. So again, I'm going to start super high level and work our way down into some details. So as most of you guys hopefully know, planning is probably the most important part. Pre-production for me is one of the most stressful parts of any task on game development. And again, everything we make, we want to try and get as much mileage out of. So we want to be very careful when we choose what we're going to make and where it fits within the sort of master plan of the game. And we really, really want to try and avoid revisional work. We know that quality in any art, any creative thing comes from iteration, but motivation and quality can also be drained from revisional work. So you spend a lot of time, put all your heart into something, and it gets cut and you have to redo it. We want to avoid that as much as we can. And we really, really take, and you'll see this throughout the entire presentation, is we do a very broad strokes first approach to everything. Always testing along the way, always using data and player experience to guide the next phase of it. So again, starting high level, working our way down. So our first task is to figure out what the heck are we going to make? What's our next behemoth that we're going to start with? We have to figure out what gameplay needs need to be met. That's, of course, gameplay is king, so we need to figure out, is there a gap in our player progression? If we look at data, and we're very obsessive is a kind word to use about how we take data on at Phoenix Labs. We have data on everything, because we've been playtesting for some time now, and we know where speed bumps are. We know where players are getting churned out. We know where they're stopping progression and spending time. So we use that to inform how we do variants on our behemoths and how we do the next new behemoth that we're going to work on. So we look at all this when we decide what we're going to do. We also need to decide, so when we're going to pick a new creature to make, does this fall under what we call a genus, or does this a brand new creature altogether? And when I say genus, what I mean is we slot all of our characters into silos, essentially, and they share common skeletons. And it makes it quite easy for us to retarget and reuse stuff from within a single silo. So there could be many, many creatures, and it makes it easy for game design to just start mocking up an experience really, really quickly with pre-existing animations that easily retarget an engine straight across. And we do this by having the ability to add or change appendages, add wings, things like that. These guys share the same skeleton. And they share the same animations oftentimes as we're blocking out experiences. But you can see it's quite divergent in design. We've got an owl bear and a bug thing. And so with adding these appendages, we use IK retargeting, things like that. We can really expand on these family trees, without a lack of a better word. This was actually an exercise in the company to see how far we can divert within a single genus. And this ended up being pretty far. We also have variants within a single type. Originally, we called this alpha and beta versions of the same one. So the one in the middle is sort of the original version of that, and you can see either end. So what we can also do is we can scale their size, obviously, and change some materialing and some surfacing. But we also take the combat into account when we do this. So the smallest, the earliest version that you encounter to the latest one, we try to show an evolution of their combat skill as well. So the earliest one you'll see, it might be a clumsy attack that they're doing, but by the time you end up fighting the hardest, the oldest version, the gnarly one, or whatever we're going to call it, he's an expert at that attack. So we never try to just do a one-for-one copy. We're always trying to add some animations in there to give some flavor and some variety, but this allows us to get a lot more mileage, again, out of our creatures. So when we're planning this out, we also have to figure out, what is this personality for this behemoth? What are their traits? What are they intrinsically motivated by? And it might sound kind of goofy. We're like, just making monsters, just make them smash people, and we'll just smack them with an axe, and it'll be over. But it really does inform a lot of things, like how do they path around an environment? How do they flee? How do they die? These are all things we kind of need to figure out before you sit down and start animating. And we've tried a few different ways to figure this out, and not all of them successful. So my first go-to, I stole this from Mike Jungbluth, hopefully you saw his talk as well. For doing any character, I typically start with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And this is great. It's basically from top to bottom, or bottom to top, really, like an order of what is important for a character. And if you really think about these things, the bottom one, physiological, just being able to eat, sleep, poop. And then next up, like security, family, society, self-esteem, and eventually nirvana, or whatever you want to call that. And these are great for saying, like, how is my character going to move through the scene? How are they going to make this choice physically? The problem we ran into with this one is anything other than that bottom level, that need to survive, that creature then has something to lose. And if they have something to lose, we suddenly feel empathy for that creature. And if our gameplay core is to go and kill this thing, and we feel empathy for it, all of a sudden there's a bit of a dissonance there, and we don't want to create that for the player. So this didn't really work for us. And ultimately, we did have some things in there, a very, very early playtest. It was the most subtle of things, but there was one stagger that we had for a creature, and he was very pathetic, and he let out a little meow like that when he got staggered. And everybody, the first time we saw it, all 4 people that were playing just stopped. And we didn't want to hit it anymore. And we knew right then, okay, that's our line that we can't cross when we create creatures. And even there was some fans, this was made by our community actually on our Discord channel, because they really liked this one creature, and they're just like, I don't want to hurt it. It's too cute. So we have to find a better way to convey personality, convey intent, convey these creatures' motivations without crossing that empathy line. Another one we very briefly tried was using the 7 deadly sins to describe what these creatures were. If you don't know what this is, it's kind of an early Christianity thing. The problem with this one, it was a little too constraining. As you can see, it's a little too limiting, and also the idea of making a lusty behemoth just was too tricky. So what do we use now? We found that simple is better. We really don't have a formula. I'm sorry to say we haven't found it yet anyways, but we've found to get team consensus is the most important thing. When we had these really convoluted descriptions and one sheets that nobody read anyways, it just became something that we didn't refer to anyways. So we try to keep things very simple and in memorable things that we can work with, like this creature is sloppy and confused, or this one is a big dumb cow and he's grumpy easily, or things like that. We try to come something that we can just hook onto. We also have to be very careful because we do share a lot of animations within a genus. Some animations do need to be quite generic, and those are the ones that are going to be shared throughout. And then we have variant-specific ones, and those are ones where we have moments that we can convey personality. But again, simplicity is kind of the key there. So that's a little bit of pre-production. Our main criteria for exiting pre-pro is we want to have some kind of a shot list that we can work from. Up to this point, we have built enough of these that we know some basic sets. We know what loco is needed. We know some basic personality sort of slots that needed to be filled. The attacks are kind of typically where we need to figure out right now. So game design and animation and programming will kind of sit together and figure out what coverage we need for attacks and things like that. Then we will get a proxy together. Actually, no, sorry, first I'm going to back up. We do concept, and that goes through a few iterations. Usually it starts with really rough, a sheet full of thumbnails of silhouettes, and we say, yes, this one here, and we start to refine. When we get close to something, usually not until it's final, but we have something that we know, okay, it's going to have wings and two heads and it's this type of leg and things like that, we'll slap together a proxy character and put that on a rig. What we want to do is have something we can block animations immediately and start getting stuff in game and testing, and also just doing a basic pass on rig wrecking. I'll talk about that in a sec as well. But the main thing, the main criteria before leaving pre-pro is that everybody on the Behemoth team has a consensus on what this creature will be and what the goal of this creature will be. So then we're ready to kind of move into production. We're all happy with the descriptions, with the design doc, and the encounter design that we've created, and what we want it to feel and look like, and we have a proxy ready. And we're ready to start animating. So our first thing we're going to do is pose the character. Very first thing. The single pose that we start with is the most important step of creating a character. It needs to find that personality and hit that personality beat. We need to check if the rig works, if the limbs and the joint placement and things like that, if we don't need to make any iterations on that. And it literally is the base for everything. All moves come from that idle pose, that main pose. If you saw earlier the difference between the owlbear and that bug creature, the bug creature has a V shape and the owlbear has an A shape, and we're able to differentiate those, and that's our silhouette, our shape language for that creature. And these often go through quite a few iterations, but really what we're after is an iconic silhouette, one that reads from all sides, and also something that's maybe not too asymmetric, because we have to mirror. We've made that mistake a few times. So after we find that pose, we're happy with it, the rig works. Usually we've got a couple of versions of the proxy under our belts. We start on to blocking. And one thing I've learned that helps speed up, because creatures can be super complex to animate, a great tip that was taught to me was to create simple geometry instead. Instead of looking at the character as a whole with all these spikes and everything, I'll start with very, very basic geo. And this will be constrained to my rig. I can just animate on this. I'm not worried about legs. I'm not worried about anything. I'm just timing, blocking, spacing, those kind of things. And then it's easy to kind of progress forward onto my final rig, add steps, things like that. But really, it's just fail fast, fail cheap. I want to know right away if this is going to work. What's the spacing of this attack or this personality moment? So you can see a quick mock-up of how that kind of looks in Engine, or in Maya, sorry. Very iterative workflow. We also throw blocking passes in game. So this is super, super old footage. This is pre-alpha, but it's a good representation of kind of what our encounter looks like at first. The player stuff, everything is just blocked. It's in-stepped. This took a extremely long time for the team to be able to look past stepped animation. I'd say probably 6 months of just forcing this on them until they got it. But it really, really helps. In half a day, I can have a set of attack moves in-game and we could be playing it and having group play tests and talking about this encounter. Does this work? What effects do we need? Do we need more coverage on attacks? Really, the main goal as soon as possible is unblocking other areas of development. So people like audio and effects, other areas of game design. We want to play test as much as possible every step. So this is a very quick and dirty way. You can see it's super ugly, but we'll get there. We did make the mistake of putting in stepped animations into a recent playtest with the public. I'm not sure why we thought they would be as forgiving as design, but they absolutely weren't. It's all they could see. So we definitely won't be doing that again. But what we're trying to figure out right now is what is our MVP, our minimum viable product. We don't want to throw a million animations into an encounter. We want as few as possible. Really, there's not that many of us on the team, so we can't spend a ton of time on that. So each of these stages goes through animation in-game, always getting feedback. And these are sort of the main stages of our animations. We'll do blocking. That sometimes will take a couple of passes. In-betweens, we typically won't move into in-betweens until we know the blocking works, and same thing for blocking plus and ultimately polish. The majority of our animations currently haven't made it past blocking plus, because that is typically considered shippable. and we kind of leave that till a little bit later. The encounter, it's a bit of a point of diminishing return at that point, and we can kind of get to it when we get to it. A little bit about layers. So everything to do with our creatures that we found is really, really helpful is to think about the performance in layers. When I'm in Maya, my broad movement is typically on my base layer, and all that texture lives on sort of concentric layers above it. So things like jiggle, finger movement, things like that. I want to keep on separate layers, and this translates into the game as well. And I'll talk about that in just a sec. So assembling all this in-game. We do a lot of things like additive layers. We have an IK solution called iKinema. I'll show that in just a sec. And that helps us with planting feet, appendages. We get hit reactions, impacts, muscle jiggle, physical movement on the creatures in game. Things like overlapping movement as well. And it really, really helps to kind of decouple that from the core animation, because if we're using blending states, or if there might be a pop in there, that affects everything, but physics can override it. So a quick example of what iKinema does for us. So again, we don't want to create really, really complex blend states, especially for things like slopes. We have a semi-procedural production pipeline for creating our environments. And so there could be a million variables that we have to account for in the nav mesh. So we want to be very, very procedural in our solution, and iKinema is one of those. So you can see this animation just played. That's just the straight walk cycle that was going down a slope. It looks like shit. But when we apply iKinema to it, and this is a very early, I'm sorry, I didn't get a newer version. There's a lot of twitches in here. But you can get at least a general idea of what iKinema does for us. It allows us to curve the the creature along a spline, lock down the feet on the path, and add a lot more detail to that. And that's just the same walk cycle. I only have to make one walk, and it works. So those are some of the components of the animation side, but I want to talk a little bit about how we tell stories with the Behemoth and how we just tell stories in general. People, as you hopefully know, are just natural storytellers. Anything we see, we will create a story so that it makes sense to us. Think about anybody you've seen on the sidewalk getting angry. You come up with your own little backstory of why they're doing that. And we do this all the time. We need everything to make sense. And how we do that is we provide subtext to what we're seeing. So let me move forward. I'll show an example of what this means. So this is an image of a very happy woman. As soon as we see this, we might start throwing ideas at why she's happy. Maybe she just got some fantastic news, or a friend just told some funny joke off camera, or maybe whatever she's drinking is really awesome. But if I change your information that you have just a little bit, so now your subtext might change. You might start thinking, the tone of this image is completely different, and we're inventing these stories all the time. If you think about all your favorite performances in film, TV, even in a book, the subtext is what made that great. If you think about a really bad scene in a movie, there was just nothing there. It was very flat. And so we use this a lot in game. I'm going to use one more example. Has anybody, I'm just going to show another show of hands. This is my last one, I promise. Has anybody not seen Forrest Gump? Okay, good. I tried to pick a movie that I was hoping everybody had seen. Let's watch this quick, and then we'll have a chat. All right, it doesn't go further, I promise. All right, so what did we just see? We just saw a woman break into a man's house and sexually assault him. That's without context, right? But everybody here's seen that movie, and we know there's a lot happening here. This is a pivotal moment for both those characters. It's a lifetime of loving and longing, and ultimately this is the course correction for both of those characters for the rest of the movie. Spoiler alert, they have a baby. So it's critical, right? Subtext is everything. If you remove context from that scene, it's super creepy. Now, if you think about any other of your favorite films, they all have those elements in there that make you really invested in those characters, make you believe them. And there's a lot at stake. So subtext in the format of like visual storytelling can be created like this. I made this formula so I sounded super smart. What it basically means is if you take a character's context and their actions and sort of combine it with staging, juxtaposition, things like that, that's how we create subtext. If anybody here watched Jeremy's talk yesterday, he kind of talked about it in the reverse way. So when you're going to act in animation, you act the subtext of the dialogue, not the dialogue itself, because there's intent there, and that's what you're supposed to act. This is how we create subtext on our own, is by observing action, staging, and context. I lost my place. And if you, excuse me. If you deviate too far from that, if you break that, that's when you start to break immersion in your characters, in your story, composition, all those things. And ultimately the believability. So that's kind of what we're after, is believability. So let's look at that in the context of how we use it in Dauntless. So here is a locomotion animation. He's just walking side to side, very basic. Super, super simple movement. But if I take that same animation, I change my framing, I put it in a combat situation, I place a player in front of it, all of a sudden this is a very threatening animation. And we're applying context to that creature. He's imposing, he's going to attack any moment. It's the same animation. If I take that animation, I make that creature run to a point that we've told the player by this point is a vent of the very substance that is supporting our life right now, and those creatures are about to consume it. All of a sudden, he's protecting this deposit that we're trying to get from him and stop him from eating. So very different context, very different subtext that we create, and important story moments. I've used the same animation every single time. So actually, this is super important. So before I move next slide. So what is important when we're creating games and experiences for players is these emergent moments. Think about any time you've told your friend about a game that was, oh, you got to try this game, it's awesome, and then you relay a story from your perspective about how that happened. That's what we're trying to create, emergent stories, those moments, those water cooler moments. I'm sure you guys talk about that as well. So that's just some of the stuff we've been working on. And there's a lot more stuff that we have. There's only so much I can fit. But we have a lot of stuff that we've got planned on the road ahead as well. We haven't even touched facial animation yet. That's something we haven't really started at all, unfortunately. There's a lot of limitations. We're currently in Unreal 4. And unfortunately, in a network situation, there are some tight constraints when we want to move creatures based on their root movement and things like that we have to sort of write on our own. Physics and frame rate is a constant challenge for us. Tool side for animation, speeding up our process again, trying to eliminate redundant work or revisional work. Animating creatures is just hard, so we want to make it easier. And automating more things. And just generic manpower. Like I said, we're only 40 people. There's 3 animators in-house. One of them is on players. One of them is on Behemoths, that's me. And one is on cinematics, NPCs, things like that. We do outsource a lot of creature stuff as well, but it's still very small. We can't throw people at our problems. We definitely have some bugs as well. What I'm going to show you guys next. So day 1, when our NDA was lifted and people were allowed to stream our game, we found almost every player found a bug. This was one when there was about 40,000 people watching a Twitch stream, and this happened.
I don't know what it's at. So hard to hit him. Oh my god, this is terrifying. I'm too scared to get near him. Because I never know what he's about to do because I can't predict his moveset.
So yeah, that wasn't awesome. That's Ikinema basically exploding into space. That's since been fixed, but that was a really fun thing to have happen on your first day of being live. So yeah, as you can see, there's a lot of stuff, a lot of things we're still working forward on, but we're still learning. And that's pretty much it. So if you guys have any questions, any other things, there's lots of time for questions. I ended up reading through that super fast. That's me on the Twitter. And if you're interested in Dauntless or Phoenix Labs, that's our URLs. And there's lots of time for questions. Did that go up? Oh, no. There it is.
Okay. Wait. I'll give you a mic.
One. Okay. I was wondering about who's designing the creatures, because you said you're animating them, and I was wondering, like, if whether the person designing them is thinking about their biology, because we've seen that some of their elements, some of their elements like come from mammals, some from birds, and you also said that they have internal structure that they share, and I was wondering if, like, how much biology goes into it, and do they have like an evolutionary path maybe? Are they like related? How does it work?
So just to make sure I understand your question, so you're asking what are the priority of influences behind the animation design? We typically will, a lot of times I will grab the very closest reference I can find. A lot of times that's a mashup of things. Like this guy in particular, the wings we were looking at, you know, hummingbird wings, dragonfly wings. Dragonfly wings are kind of what I went to. We look at just all kinds of things, like a wasp mating and a bear doing something. So it's always a mashup. Typically, we get a lot of freedom from design. Design doesn't typically dictate how or what they do. It's more just, I need an attack in this that covers this area, maybe with the tail. Here's what I'm thinking for the experience. It's a very collaborative process for that. A lot of times I will go to audio or effects, and we'll brainstorm a lot as well. I try to not drive those as much. It's a very team-based effort. So if the audio is like, I've got this really cool idea, I want this guy to be full of snot and very slobbery and all that stuff, that's going to inform how we pose and how we move it. He's going to be all goofy and wobbly, or he's just very focused and he shoots laser beams out of his eyes. Then it's going to be a little bit affect how that timing and staging works. But for the most part, it's YouTube, BBC, Motion Library, Planet Earth, all kinds of things. We go everywhere. Sorry, I don't have a really, like, this is my formula. It's kind of whatever works. We feel it out. That's, again, back to that iteration thing. We're always iterating until it feels right, and then we can move forward.
Cool speech, cool presentation, really cool. So you mentioned before that this character was shared the same skeleton as the other one, and you had some okay solving. I'm guessing a lot of the stuff is just added through animation layers?
No. Most of his animations are kind of bespoke to that creature at this point. When we first started blocking out gameplay, we did use the ones from the one that was on the left of it. There's actually still a couple in the gameplay right now that are the owl bears. They don't retarget great, but it is one-to-one. Like we try to keep pivot points, all that stuff doesn't change necessarily, but we can change things from a plantar leg to a reverse knee. This one we added four more legs on his stomach and wings, and typically the other bear has wings that come out of his forearm. This one has wings that come out of the back, and 2 sets of them. So we can just change appendages. We're using IK for retargeting if we need to. It's not super elegant, it's not as elegant as your guys's, but we do end up batching a lot of stuff like that. Again, we have, during our pre-production process, we're trying to figure out what degree of variant it is from that base skeleton. This was an extreme version. There are other ones where you saw at the end of the trailer, there was that raven-looking one. That's another variant of that owl bear, and that shares almost everything. There's another, that's sort of the extreme version of that lineage, and it has much more, it's a much harder encounter. The effects are completely different. How that experience progresses is vastly different, but some of those animations, again, we're just changing the context, and it feels new.
Cool, cool. Sorry, do you mind if I follow up with one more? So the animations that you were sharing, I'm guessing the animation then would just be on the core skeleton, then any additional bones would be kind of a top one, but any animation that you're actually sharing is only on the core skeleton.
Yeah, like so this one here, the animation, the wings flapping, that's an animation, that's an additive layer in Engine, and I'm driving that with a curve. There's actually quite a bit on him that we're driving with a curve.
That's what I was thinking, same things like the legs, the appendages underneath, the legs underneath the body, and then the...
Oh no, that's part of that idle animation, yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
cool.
Thank you very much, Simon.
Thank you.